Good evening, everybody. I am Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and welcome to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. We are glad you could join us. For those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU's School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and practical campaign training, and we facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics and leadership. And we are so pleased to mark Black History Month by learning more about the incredible life and career of Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman elected to Congress and the first Black major party presidential candidate. And we are fortunate to have with us this evening Dr. Anastasia Curwood. She is Associate Professor of History and the Director of African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. And she is the author of the recently published terrific book, Shirley Chisholm, Champion of Black Feminist Power Politics. And we're going to save plenty of time for your questions. On the bottom of the screen, you'll notice a Q&A button there. So please feel free to type in some questions during our discussion this evening. And a replay of this entire program will be available on our website. So Dr. Curwood, thank you and welcome.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for wanting to know more about Shirley Chisholm. It's really cool to be in DC, at least virtually, because of course that was most of what her career was.
Exactly. So I want to actually start at the end of your book, because at the very end, you in the acknowledgement section, you write about when you first learned who Shirley Chisholm was and ultimately why you decided to write this book about her. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so the story goes, so what Professor Fischer Martin is referring to is the photograph on page 355 or something like that. That is of my parents with Shirley Chisholm. And my mother was the treasurer for Chisholm for President in Massachusetts. My father was is a journalist, and was covering the campaign for the Boston Globe and the Boston Phoenix. And they gave her a ride from the airport, and there they are in her hotel room sharing a laugh. So I saw that photograph when I was a young girl. It was taken by a family friend. And I was very confused about who that was in the picture, because she looked a little like my Auntie Sally, but not quite. And so I said, "Who is that? Is that Auntie Sally?" And my parents said, "No, that's Shirley Chisholm. She ran for president, and you could too." So
there you go.
so I thought about it. I said, "Oh, okay, no kidding. Well, maybe I should." And I thought about it. And by the time I was 10, I decided against that I was not. I wouldn't run for president after all.
It's never too late. It's never too late.
Yeah. Yes, I suppose I've got it 40 years or so to make that decision. But
so
anyway,
why did you decide to write the book? I mean, you write about how there wasn't very much out there about her, which is really surprising.
Yeah, well, it really was, because, as that little story shows, I just grew up thinking that everybody knew about her, and that, she was an important figure, certainly to me. She made me think, oh yeah, of course, as a young Black girl, I can run for president. So I was teaching a course on biography as a professor of history, and I went looking for a biography of her. I thought, oh, that would be a perfect biography to assign. Well, I couldn't find anything except for young adult books or children's books. So that was 15 years ago. And that was, then it was a done deal. I decided I was going to write it.
Do it. So take us back to her childhood. She was born Shirley St. Hill and born in Brooklyn, but then you spent a fair amount in the early part of the book talking about how she was raised and spent a lot of her childhood, I think between the ages of 4 and 10, in Barbados. growing up where her family was from. How did that shape her, the Barbados experience as a child?
Well, it shaped her in I would say, 3 different ways. One was she met her grandmother, who was from Barbados, never left as far as I know. Her grandmother encouraged her to speak her mind, be fearless, use her own capacities to be self-determined. So she said her grandmother was really influential on her growing up. The second thing was the schools, that she was in schools where there were Black teachers, people in leadership positions were Black, people doing all sorts of work were Black, The dumbest kid in the class was Black, the smartest kid in the class was Black. So she really saw the whole full spectrum of Black experiences. And then the third thing is that being in a majority Black and a Black-led country, she saw that there was really no grounds for the inferiority that was assumed in terms of white supremacy ideology here in the United States. And that's actually a common thread that has been documented with other Caribbean immigrants, that people come from Black people come from the Caribbean and they see Jim Crow, they would see American Jim Crow and say, what is this? This is illegitimate. And a lot of activists were of Caribbean descent in the early part of the 20th century when she was growing up.
And then she came back to the States. And you write about the impact that both of her parents had on her. Her mother, seemed to be very strong. She basically said, in this life, you have 1 or 2 friends, everyone else is an acquaintance. And then, it encouraged her to kind of keep going when facing any kind of barrier. Yet she was not very much into the notion of Shirley being involved in politics and wasn't very supportive of that later in her life.
Yeah, so she had a complicated relationship with her family. She absolutely adored her father and claimed that she was her father's favorite. Siblings and other members of the family dispute that. But she did have a close connection. Oh yeah, there they are. Yeah, so on the right is Charles St. Hill, her father, and on the left is her mother, Ruby Seal St. Hill. Her father was really encouraging about politics, introduced her to Marcus Garvey and the United Negro Improvement Association, introduced her to labor unions and labor organizing, revered the Roosevelts, and as did Chisholm herself. And so really introduced her to a lot of these concepts. Her mother, on the other hand, was really resolved and self-possessed person. And reading between the lines, they didn't get along terribly well, but modeled for her daughter, resourcefulness and sticking to what she thought was right. And also some cosmopolitanism. She was part of a church that had a multiracial membership, and so she did learn from her mother as well. But after her father passed away, she did stop. The family became estranged. And so she and 2 of her sisters and her mother really never spoke after that.
And you write about her father's kind of support of her politically, and even a quote that that you attribute to him before he died, where he said, "Shirley, I know you're going to be a great woman, but I'm not going to live to see it." And he actually left her, a trust with a fairly well amount of money for that time, right? Which actually helped her launch her political career, and I think also caused some of the rift between the mother and sisters and Shirley.
Yes, yeah. That's a kind of foundational moment in the story, or in her life, where yes, so he had a modest inheritance that was distributed to all the girls and his wife, and then there was a life insurance policy that he designated to Shirley, and her family was really insulted, upset, thought that Shirley herself had influenced him to give that to her and not to them, and wanted her to share it with them. And because they'd all contributed to the family's wealth. At that point, they'd all been working and all saving together. And so they thought that, well, all for one for all. Well, she didn't do that, and she needed cash. At the time her father passed away, that was right when she was getting involved with the Unity Democratic Club in Brooklyn. And she was able to financially support that organization, and she was able to, she had some money in the bank for her first political campaign. So she made a really, fraught choice there.
Right.
She was nothing if not ambitious, and that's one of those things that shows it.
And before she became involved in politics, though, she obviously went to college. I think was the first person in her family to do so. And how did that transform her, that experience? And then deciding to go into teaching as a vocation, how did that lead into being politically active for her?
Yeah, she as you know from reading, and as the future readers of the book will read, she really loved debate club, and she had a professor at Brooklyn College, and she went to Brooklyn College. It was free, and she lived at home, so that was the financially responsible thing that she did. But anyway, she loved her political science classes. And she had this professor mentor tell her, you really should think about politics. And she said, are you kidding? I'm a Black woman. That's not going to work. I'm supposed to go and be a teacher. And that was a ticket to the middle class for Black women in the 1940s, in the middle of the 20th century. Was one of them was teaching. And so that's what she decided to do. And she loved it. She said, I like teaching because it made me feel big. And she rose to leadership positions, first at a private primary school or early childhood education school, and then in the city of New York. But she did get involved eventually with tenants' rights organizations in New York's public housing. And New York's public housing is sort of it's a character in this book that doesn't quite get fleshed out, but she spent a lot of her life in New York public housing, and then she became involved in politics through New York public housing and tenant activism. And so that was sort of the gateway. And she met, through her hairdresser, she met the man who would be her future strategist, Mac Holder. And then she got involved in Mac Holder's, one of his first campaigns to get a Black judge elected in the borough in Brooklyn. So she, it was one of those, it was an indirect path to politics, but then she never stopped being a teacher. And we can talk about that, over the next few minutes. She never stopped being a teacher. She first of all privileged issues that affected parents and children and education. And she also taught her staffers, and she also taught other people in Congress. She used a teaching approach, as in her congressional colleagues, other members.
She also got married. This is her husband on their wedding day here, Conrad. And he was very supportive early on of her working, and then later in politics, at least in the early days.
Yeah, he really was. He was, he was a rebound guy for her. Um,
She had this elusive fiance called
yeah.
R in the
Yes, yes. Yeah. So she was engaged before Conrad, right out of college. Actually, she met him her senior year of college over her Easter break. They were both working at a jewelry factory. Um, and and so she fell head over heels for this guy. Um, she eventually discovered that he was actually married, had a wife in Jamaica, and that he wound up getting deported back to Jamaica. He was part of a human smuggling ring, and he was part of this ring that was bringing people illegally from Jamaica. And so she did not know either of these things. And her mother never liked him, thought that he was
mother's intuition,
mother's
right?
intuition. So the last time she saw him was when he was at Ellis Island waiting to get deported. So anyway, she said she had a breakdown after that. And this is sort of a rare moment of disclosure for her. She tended to be a very private person, but she did acknowledge that she went into a tailspin after that, and that she wanted nothing to do with men anymore or marriage. And Conrad said it sort of wheedled his way into her life with gentleness and doted on her, and he doted on her for their entire marriage. That he said in an interview, I knew what I had. He felt like she was the best catch ever, and so he kind of did everything that she needed. And he was secure enough in his masculinity to do that.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier her involvement in so many of these political and civic organizations. It seemed like those were so critical to her rise in politics. And I guess just talk a little bit about that decision to actually go from being politically involved in these organizations to actually making a run for office for the state assembly.
Yeah. So again, she was a very ambitious person. And I almost called the book Aim High. I wanted to call the book Aim High. And my publisher said, every major biography or most major biographies are titled with their subject. And so I gave in, but really you could have called this book Aim High, because she had so many ambitions for herself and for her ideals. For herself, she started getting involved in these groups, and she was part of a group that Mac Holder, her strategist and mentor, had. Eventually, she tried to take it over. So, and they had a falling out over that. She put herself up for election for president of the organization in the late 1950s, and then they had this rift. And she left and went to this new organization, the Unity Democratic Club. The Unity Democratic Club is important because it became the seat of Democratic political power in that assembly district in Brooklyn. And for folks who are not as familiar with the way that the party was set up in New York City, it was by assembly district. And so the existing club was called the 17th Assembly District Club, our Democratic Club, and Chisholm was part of that club as well. She made it seem in her memoir like she was involved in that one first and then went to Unity, but actually she was involved in both, sort of seeing how things worked out, because Unity was an insurgent club, and it eventually captured the district leader seat. And that became the dominant force. And she went with that. She supported it really strongly after that point, and she made a bid for leading that club. And the leader of the club before her was called up to be a judge in Brooklyn, in Kings County. And so that was her opportunity to run for that assembly seat in 1964, and she won it.
And she won. And then, her time in the assembly, what were her priorities there? And then did she always have an eye to go higher and run for national or Congress? And how did that sort of trajectory happen for her?
Yeah, so she was going to go as high as she could go.
Yeah.
And she had her eye, absolutely had her eye on what the possibilities were. So going to the historical context of 1964, 1965, she got into Albany in 1965 and immediately figured out which way the wind was blowing there, managed to become an ally of the majority speaker through supporting his election. And then that summer, the Voting Rights Act was passed by the US Congress and signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. And in that aftermath, it became clear that there would be more of a shakeup before the census in 1970 would redraw congressional districts. That congressional districts were going to get redrawn. There was also a Supreme Court decision, a SCOTUS decision of one person, one vote. And so she was watching that, and it was pretty clear that Brooklyn, which was gerrymandered to have its Black population split between 4 districts, that Brooklyn was likely to have a Black congressperson, just because Bedford-Stuyvesant was a center of Black life in New York. People tend to forget about it. They think about Harlem, but Brooklyn was really important. So she knew that was going on. She said that she was drafted, and that she had that these women came to her house and handed her some tiny amount of money that they had scraped together from their domestic service wages, and that then she knew she had to run. And I'm sure that did happen. And that she felt like she had this mandate. But she also went through the process that the Unity Democratic Club undertook, or many of its members, to choose someone to put forward as a Black candidate from that congressional district.
Here's a photo you have in the book of her.
Yeah, yes. So there she is. There she is running for Congress in 1968. And so she was chosen by the committee to elect a Negro congressman. And then she had to win the primary, because this is not just the Unity Democratic Club. This is across a bigger part of the borough. The election was in the 12th congressional district. And so the regular Democratic Party put up their own candidate, although they said they weren't. It was clear who he was. There were there was one other candidate, a woman, but she had the machinery of Unity Democratic Club behind her, and she campaigned successfully in that primary. And then that's her in the general, and she campaigned successfully in the general. And I can tell that story if you want me to.
Yeah, and then she had a health scare in between, right?
Yeah, she did. Yeah, she absolutely did. It was a benign tumor, but she had to have a hysterectomy to remove some fibroids, and lost a lot of weight. She was not a large person. She was barely 5 feet. And she became even tinier. And there were all sorts of rumors after the primary that, oh, she's disappeared, she's sick, she's not well, and so she had to get back out there. So she campaigned from the sound car that we saw her in. And she said she wrapped a towel around her waist so her clothes would fit,
Oh my
actually
goodness.
stay on. Yeah, but she had to be seen out there, and she was driven to campaign.
And she campaigned quite openly with women's groups and basically saying how it was important to elect more women to Congress. And they were a key factor in her general election victory, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, she knew that women voters outnumbered men in the district by 3-1. And the problem was that her opponent, James Farmer, who was famous, he was the national director, or had been the national director of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, one of the big civil rights organizations. So the problem, though, was that Farmer didn't realize or didn't take seriously that demographic, and he campaigned on sort of this strong masculine vision. And his pamphlets actually read, we need a strong man's voice in Washington. And Chisholm figured out, by this point she was back, she had mended fences with Mac Holder. And so the two of them figured out, and she was going to go to all these women's groups. Jewish women's groups were extraordinarily important in Brooklyn, and Jewish voters. And so she spoke to the Emerald Lazarus Club. She went to Bushwick and went door to door. She really understood who her voters were. And she said that, well, I hated to do this because I hate to play to these kinds of things, but I really have to do it. I used the women's issue to run, and she was right. And that was her ace in the hole.
And so she wins, and she immediately announces that she would not be, quote, a quiet freshman congressman, you right? And she says, my greatest political asset, which professional politicians fear, is my mouth, out of which comes all kinds of things that one shouldn't always discuss for reasons of political expedience. So she doesn't come in quietly.
No, that came from Susan Brown Miller's profile of her in the New York Times Magazine in 1969. Yeah, well, the thing was, she was outspoken. She'd always been outspoken. She embarrassed her aunt in Barbados by complaining about how boring a preacher was that happened to be married to a guest they had in their living room. She really did have a mouth. And so, and she would say it. She got headlines that way. She got invited to college campuses because she spoke out against the Vietnam War, said she wouldn't vote for any more bills that funded the military without funding domestic programs. So, that was pretty true to form. She was absolutely right.
And you have a chapter called the Chisholm Mystique. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, of course, it's a play on the feminine mystique.
Yes.
But hers is different. She was not. She had sort of this other mystique that was high profile. She changed her clothes and her hair. She started wearing her wigs, and
the makeover is incredible, right?
Yeah, she had a makeover. So that's one way you can tell when a photograph is taken, it's before or after makeover. She got to DC in 1969, and she looked like a little school teacher from Brooklyn, one of her aides said. But she had that new style, and she's just started kind of causing trouble in a good way. So she refused her committee assignment. She spoke out against the war. She started talking on college campuses, and then she had this group of women working for her in her office. She had the unprecedented an unprecedented all-women staff in her congressional office. She had a woman who was a legislative assistant. She had women doing the casework. She had women doing everything in her office. And it was an interracial group of Black and white women at first. She did eventually hire some men and some white men who remained, who still credit her with an important start in their own political careers. People who rose to high positions on the Hill and the staff, or who went into elected office themselves. But Chisholm walking along with this group of women in the halls of the Capitol, she just had this charisma. And so that's, that Chisholm mystique is that charisma and that image that she started to build in 1969.
Well, and then speaking of the feminine mystique, you have this photo in here. Here she is, of course, with Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and the National Women's Political Caucus, and her involvement with the feminist groups of the time and what that meant for her politically as she was coming up through politics. Can you talk a little bit about the women's movement at the time and where she fit into that, and areas where there might have been some disagreement, and areas where you think might have helped her politically?
Yeah, she, in her assembly seat in 1967, she independently got in touch with Betty Friedan and the New York chapter of NOW, and said, I want to be involved. So let's, let me know. She became a ceremonial vice president of the New York chapter, and those women from the women's movement were her allies on the Hill. And that photograph is from 1971, from the founding of the National Women's Political Caucus. She and Bella Abzug undertook what would have been a bill to create universal childcare in the United States. And it always blows me away. What would have happened if the bill, which they got through both houses of Congress, got through conference committee, got to President Nixon's desk, if Nixon had not been influenced by Daniel Patrick Moynihan or whoever, if he had signed it, we would have universal child care in this country. And if there had been a veto-proof majority, we would have had universal child care in this country. And so she and Abzug shared that they both understood that. I think Abzug's coming from a position where women, she wanted women to have the same opportunities as men. And so was Chisholm, but Chisholm also understood the economic constraints on women of color in particular.
Right.
And so that was a moment of convergence. But yes, there was divergence. And unfortunately, it happened over the presidential campaign in large part because feminists supported her in word, but not in deed. And
because they didn't think she could actually win.
Right.
In many ways. Yeah. And just to jump ahead to that time period. So she's reelected for another term in the House. She decides to run for president. She publishes her autobiography / book of political essays called Unbought and Unbossed, of course, famously referred to in many ways, and was her slogan, right? But there's a lot that you are able to pull in from that, but you also write very frankly about, it's her own take on her life, which sometimes can be a little skewed, and that there were some components of that book that maybe contradicted reality in some respects. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the political autobiography is a genre that we're very familiar with now.
Yes, we are.
And that's what that was. And, I've alluded to a couple things where what she disclosed about her first relationship and about her relationship with her father, and the timing of her participation in the regular Democratic Club versus Unity Democratic Club. So yeah, she wanted to create an image of herself as a maverick, and she was. But here's the other thing: is that she was not. She would collaborate and create coalition with anybody who could help her advance her principles. And her principles were democracy and small d democracy, increasing the political power and improving the lives of the least of us, women, poor people, Black and brown people, young people. So she wrote it like that, that this was her commitment from an early age, and it was in some ways. I mean, she was raised to appreciate the Union, but it definitely makes her sound even more principled than she was, and the reality is more complicated.
Yeah. So you write about her run for president in 1972, that she knew someone had to go first, right? And she felt compelled to do it, but she had no illusion that she could actually win. But what did she hope to attain by running, and what propelled her to do that?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that women and her feminist allies thought she couldn't win.
Yeah.
And Chisholm herself, I don't believe, expected to win either. Many people said that she was crazy for thinking that she would win. But she wanted to assert her right to run, first of all. But the second reason was to create a coalition. The idea was not that she had to wind up with the presidency, although I'm sure she would have she would have stepped in gladly. Her idea was to bring a coalition of Black, brown women, poor, non-English speaking people together, who, the people who were experiencing political disempowerment, and that those people could then bargain on the Democratic Party platform and bargain with the candidates for the Democratic Party nomination. 1972, as I'm sure many in your audience know, was the last contested convention.
Right.
And so the idea was that this coalition was going to put pressure on that nominee. And that was what she wanted to do.
Well, and then she ends up, of course, and there's a famous photo in the book of her speaking at the convention there as well. So she gets delegates. She actually, that whole process, like you're talking about, a contested convention, there's delegate trading back and forth going on, political machines at work, right? She doesn't obviously win, but she ends up with a speaking spot at the convention.
Exactly. Yeah. And not only that, but she spoke a couple of times before her concession speech, which gets her down on the floor and has that. I mean, that's a pretty iconic moment. I actually have a photograph there. Well, I'll get too deep into the weeds about existing photographs, but there are two famous photographs of her at that podium. She spoke to the Women's Caucus, and she spoke to the Black Caucus to try to get them to stand behind her, at least on the first ballot. And then, and then you can then split off for your candidate. But we need some delegates to bargain with so that we can get this candidate she wanted a woman vice president, a Black secretary of what was HEW at the time, and a Native American Indigenous secretary of the Interior. That was one version that she said, but there were, she just wanted to have some influence over that over the eventual nominee. And those caucuses, she got hostility at the Black caucus. Well, she got a lot of cheering from some and some real hostility from others. She got a lot of love in the room from the Women's Caucus, but then they said, well, we're not going to vote for her. She's not going to win. So that coalition didn't come together. Then she had there were other folks who were working for her campaign who didn't get along interpersonally. So it was a real challenge for her to hold that together. And she said she lost sleep over that in the campaign. And she really had to recover from that she had all this hope that this coalition would come together, and then it didn't.
And so after that, she goes back to Congress, where she serves another couple of terms.
Yeah, 5 more. Yeah.
Yeah. And how was that for her going back into the House after she has this presidential campaign? And how was she then perceived in the House?
Well, this is the great unsung part of her career, and every other biography has just gone up to the presidential campaign, but she became an extraordinarily effective legislator, wheeler dealer, as Barbara Lee has called her, coalition builder in the House. And sometimes even in the Senate, when she's appearing there and collaborating there. So her 10 years after running for president got her on the Rules Committee. She was a beloved and very well respected congressperson in a bipartisan basis. So she had Jack Kemp at her second wedding. She got remarried. A spoiler alert for the book.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about that too.
Yeah,
a little drama, soap opera in the book.
A little bit, yeah. She got swept off her feet again, and I mean, remember that poor Conrad was the rebound guy, and he was safe.
Here's the new handsome husband.
Here. So that is Arthur Hardwick, who was an assemblyman from Buffalo. Before, and that's where they met. But he was married at the time. Obviously, she was married at the time. And then his wife passed away, and she decided to get a divorce and marry him. So I believe they were carrying a torch for each other for a good 10 years. So she said that she said a few things about Conrad that he couldn't handle being in the background.
Right.
She said that he scared her at one point.
That to be the case early on in their marriage. I guess maybe later on it was.
I think later on, perhaps, and I think that she was in love with somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. But she talks about her longevity in politics, and there's a great quote in the book where she says, "Many of my friends actually wondered how I stayed so long in politics. They always thought I'd get thrown out along the way, but for some reason I survived, and I survived because I think precisely because of the confidence that was built up in me because of how I pursued the political trail when I did." But this notion of confidence for her is just a theme throughout her life, right?
Yeah. She just believed she could. She believed she was the best person to do it. She believed she was capable, that she was competent, and she wasn't wrong. She was extraordinarily capable. She did her homework. She was a good reader. She was a good student in terms of studying bills, and so yeah, that was just who she was. And she said her grandmother helped foster it within her. Mm-hmm. Her father did too, but she was her other sisters. 2 of her other sisters went with her to Barbados, and she was the one who came back like that. Really confident. So it was her as a person, her temperament.
Well, let me bring in some questions here. We have a few. One of them here is from one of our professors, Lucy Getman. She says, thank you for sharing about Shirley Chisholm. Do you think that if she ran for president today, that she would win?
Oh gosh. That's a great question. Okay, so I don't know. To be truthful, I don't know. So what might contribute to her success was her populism, the way that she just addressed the people very directly. And so I think, yeah, that her as a candidate, she was a good candidate. She just didn't have the money.
Right.
And she was a Black woman. So she did not get the support of a lot of these guys. Have sexism and racism decreased enough so that she wouldn't run into that problem? She would absolutely run into that problem. So no, I don't think so. Could she overcome it? Maybe. Maybe so.
Certainly be formidable.
Yeah. And her capacity to build coalitions, I think that would be that. If she could win, that would be it.
Yeah.
But Black women.
Although at the time it seemed like there were so many more coalitions and machine politics, and right, that was sort of in the heyday of a lot of that. Maybe less so now. Here's Obama a question. Yeah, exactly. Here's a question from Laura Gibson, asking about her committee assignments. What were her committee assignments and why did she refuse them? You talk a bit about that as well in the book, especially from her first term when she was elected, and then the second term, maybe getting the committee assignments that she wanted in the second term.
Yeah. So the first committee assignment she got was forestry. She's
agriculture.
She was sent to agriculture, and her subcommittee was forestry. And she was an early childhood education teacher, interested in improving schools and government services, and now she did come around to say, well, actually I could have helped on, agriculture controls food stamps, for example, and I could have had something to say about that. But yeah, so it was forestry. So she protested, and everybody told her it was political suicide, is what she says. She got headline news on Walter Cronkite, but then she got put on Veterans Affairs, and she was happier on Veterans Affairs. She conducted a study on racism in the military, and then eventually she got rewarded. She supported Tip O'Neill for his becoming speaker. I have to go. It was one speaker before Tip O'Neill. It went from McCormick to. I'm having a brain brain melt.
I find it in here. Yeah, I know you do talk about that a bit in here. She knew how to play the political game in many respects.
Well, that's just it. So
she backed the right horse too.
And she backed the right horse. So she was rewarded for that with education and labor. And that was the committee assignment she really had wanted. And so she got that committee assignment in after the 1970 election. And she had a great impact on education and labor. In fact, after she went to rules in 1977, she still was sort of coming back to education and labor. She would testify, and Carl Perkins was the chair, and he really respected her, and so he would call on her, and she had many friends on that committee. So it was first it was forestry and agriculture, then thank you, Carl Albert, and then and then it was and then Veterans Affairs, education and labor, and rules.
And let's see, here's another question about her time in Congress. Why did she get hostility from the Black caucus? You write about about that as
Yeah.
well, joining at the Black Caucus when it first became the actual Congressional Black Caucus.
Yeah, she was a founding member.
Yeah.
So she said they were jealous of all the attention she got, and she was the only woman, and she got all the attention, and that they were jealous about that. And that might have been true. But there was also a sense that she wasn't playing the old boys network games, all of her men colleagues came from slightly different political realities, but some of them had been playing the game for a long time and really sort of coming up in that system. And she had been too, but it was not the system that they were used to. And she just leapfrogged over them when she declared that she was running for president. And they were mad because they had been carrying on a series of meetings to try to determine if a Black man should run and which man should it be.
Right.
And then she just ran over that. So they saw her as a spoiler, as a disruptor, and not all of them. There were 3 who were more supportive, but the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Charlie Diggs, saw her as a spoiler and a disruptor, and wanted her to step down.
Here's another question. What can Black women today who are interested in running for office learn from Shirley Chisholm's legacy?
Oh, well, so much. Where do I start? I mean, I learned, I'm a direct research institute myself at Kentucky. I have, I'm a department chair, and I use the things that Shirley Chisholm did. So the number one thing is that she figured out where the power lay and where the pressure points were. So, and I call the book, the subtitle is Champion of Black Feminist Power Politics, because she was interested in Black feminist power as, not just Black feminism, but how do we redistribute power and through politics. And so her analysis of power, as we've been talking about, she knew how to back the right horse. She knew how to count votes. She really had just a really good nose. And so I always ask myself, okay, well, who has the power in this situation, and why are people doing what they're doing? And where could I bring some pressure in terms of exercising, power for good? You can use it for good or evil. And in Chisholm's case, she really was looking to expand democracy, and the people in her office had a saying that the true, the right, and the beautiful. I think the true, the good, and the beautiful. Like, as long as what they were doing adhered to that, then they were all in. The other thing, though, is that Chisholm was a human like all of us here, and she wasn't she was extraordinary, but she was not a superhero, or she didn't have superpowers. She was a human. And so it's really important to understand that you can be a human being and run for political office, and you can be a Black female human, right, and run for political office. And so, what she had was this belief in her own capacities, and we can learn that from her, that we'll take our human selves and seek leadership.
We also have a question about what you think is the most overlooked component about her life when we're thinking about her legacy today.
Yeah. I think it is it's those 14 years in Congress and the people she taught. Her as a teacher. So she taught all of these staffers. She was a mentor to Barbara Lee, who was well known, also Maxine Waters, also Donna Brazile. Even after Congress, when she was in the National Political Congress of Black Women, a group that she co-founded. So she mentored anybody. She loved teaching. That was something that was really important to her. And so she got people, so she really gave people a free rein in the office. Her staffers could work on any issue that was the true, the right, and the beautiful, that was aligned with her ideals. So, it's her as a teacher in Congress, I think, that people don't really understand.
Let's see, we have time for one more question. Sierra is asking, did this research and writing prompt a desire to write other autobiography or other biographies about lesser known female minority politicians? And if so, is there anything you change about your approach to writing and researching?
Oh gosh. Yeah, well, so I remain curious, and yeah, I would love to write another book about a Black woman leader, politician. I just need to rest a little first.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you said, just think about, how well known Shirley Chisholm is, and the fact that there really hasn't been too many biographies of her.
Yeah.
That there's countless other incredible, Black female politicians that, don't have as much written about them as well.
Yeah, well, and it's, yes, so Black women in general don't have very many biographies. That's changing. I'm part of a collective of Black women biographers, and we are supporting each other as we write these books. But it's also hard for people to write about heroes or iconic figures. And so, it was really hard. It took me 15 years. So what would I do differently? I think I'd probably look for somebody who actually has an archive that's easier to find and get to.
Right.
But you know what? I would never, I would do it all again.
Well, congratulations on this book. And yeah, do let us know when your next one comes out, because this is really terrific. And we appreciate you spending some time with us tonight to talk more about it. And I want to thank everybody else for tuning in. We have a couple of more events coming up, which you can register on from our website on Wednesday, March 1st. That's next Wednesday. I can't believe it's March already. Fearless Women, Feminist Patriots, from Abigail Adams to Beyonce. We're kicking off Women's History Month with Dr. Elizabeth Cobbs from Texas A&M. She's going to discuss her new book. And then on the 22nd of March, we are going to talk to Rebecca Boggs Roberts about her new book, Untold Power, The Fascinating Rise and Complex Legacy of First Lady Edith Wilson. So we hope you all will join us for those discussions, and we have a few more that we'll be announcing soon. And again, thank you, Anastasia, for joining us tonight, and great to see you.
No, this has been really fun. Thanks for your great questions and your close read of the book. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody. Good night.